Welcome everyone, Costin here with my campaign overview guide for Skrag the Slaughterer for the Ogre Kingdoms. The Ogres are a relatively weak faction, even though they shouldn't be. They have a pretty decent army roster. The problem is a lot of that army roster is actually hard to get to because you can only recruit the good Ogre units, the higher tier Ogre units, from the Ogre camps. And the camps are limited in numbers, they're vulnerable, and they create a lot of problems. But on top of that, you won't even have the economy for a fairly long time to be able to get those units. Like, even being able to recruit an entire army of Gorgers as Skrag is actually a significant investment in your campaign. It just will take you a fairly decent length of time to be able to get those Gorgers. Since Skrag is focused on getting them, they're pretty good units, pretty powerful in a battle, but it does simply take time to do so. It's not a question of growth, really. It's a question of money. See, the problem is the Ogres generate very little money from their economic buildings in the settlements they hold. But they do want to hold settlements, primarily really to get trade resources. So for instance, there's some salt here, you want to get those trade resources, you want to trade, because otherwise the only economy they're going to have is from the camps they put down. And the thing about the camps, limited numbers, they can generate a good amount of money, but it takes time to build them up and you have to spend a lot of money to do so. Now, the greenskins or some other races can have these same issues. But here's the difference. A race like the Greenskins doesn't have any kind of economic problems because they have an enormous amount of post-battle loot and sacking benefits from the very start. They earn a ridiculous amount of money from sacking, looting, settlements, and post-battle gold. As the Ogres, you don't have that. You don't earn more money from looting and sacking settlements, even though you really should, as a faction. And instead you're kind of in this weird situation where you are a hybrid horde faction, horde settlement faction, where you want to hold settlements, especially for their trade resources, but you also want to build camps. So it's just a weird situation, and I think the system doesn't work quite that well. So Ogres do have a lot of problems. And what this translates into is you have a race that has some mid-game, late-game potential, though even then they're not going to compare to, say, something like the High Elves or the Warriors of Chaos, but they have potential there, but they're incredibly weak early game until they get multiple camps running out, and if they can, and only really if you can protect those camps, the Ogres are pretty vulnerable. They won't have the economy to run multiple armies. I mean, it's harder to run multiple armies as either Skrag or Greases than it is to run multiple armies as Belegar with 150% upkeep from the very start of his campaign. Keep that in mind. Keep that particular aspect in mind. On top of that, Ogres also have a major disadvantage in that their lords and their lord choices are not particularly great. Their caster lords are okay, but the hunters leave a bit to be desired, at least until they can get the Stonehorn mount at level 15. Then they become pretty decent. So there's a lot of issues with Ogres. With that in mind, let's talk about Skrag's situation. So campaign benefits wise, he gets 10% campaign movement range, 1 hero capacity for butchers, and hero crew rank for butchers. So you can get butchers, you can get more butchers in your campaign if you're playing as Skrag. On top of that, when we're looking at his skill tree, well, we should look at his names, because there is something very substantial over here. You get the big name called World Swallower, which gives you 20 diplomatic relations with all factions and 8% campaign movement range. Now, what's interesting to note with the Ogres is that, yes, there is a level of an aversion that factions have with them, but playing as Skrag, you can more than make up for it, and you don't have an aversion with the Greenskins. You can make really good deals with the Greenskins from the very start. Though you wouldn't necessarily want to do that. In fact, the best thing in your campaign would be to make deals with the factions of Order, or some factions of Order, because you want the trade agreements, you want the trade output to come in. Like, if you can make an alliance with Belegar, for instance, that would be a great situation. There are, of course, going to be significant issues when it comes to that. On top of that, he gets Gorger's Onslaught, 8% more campaign movement range, winds of magic, cooldown to spells. He's not a melee fighter, he's a caster, but he is pretty decent. And he also gets 8% casualty replenishment for Gorgers and minus 50% upkeep for Gorger units, as well as having the healer skill, which can give him 6% extra casualty replenishment. So, Skrag can move from battle to battle. He is pretty effective in a fight, even though he's lacking the melee skill tree. He still has pretty decent stats. But the one big disadvantage is he only has one quest item that isn't necessarily that great. Though 5% casualty or 5% upkeep is certainly beneficial, as is the Cauldron of the Great Maw. But still, it's not really a great item for battles. Now, let's talk a bit about this campaign situation, which is always going to be determined by victory conditions. In Skrag's case, the one victory, you shouldn't necessarily worry too much about a long campaign victory condition early on. You should more so care about the fact that you have to beat the border princes. That is a bit of a complication that, honestly, you could do without. The reason it's a complication comes down to this fact when we're looking at Skrag. The problem is this. You don't want to deal with this area of the map. Like, the entirety of the border prince's territory is very exposed, very long, it's difficult to defend. And since you have limited armies, it's not great having to deal with this portion of the map. So you may want to leave it. I mean, you might be able to get a peace treaty with the border princes pretty quickly in your campaign. Like, beat this army here, take their settlements, maybe beat another army around here, and then you can make a peace deal. Or you could decide to wipe them out. The problem that happens here is Belegar, who has an army that's far more powerful than anything you can put together against them, because the issue with ogres is they might have decent stats, like ogre bulls, which you'll be spamming from early on in your campaign. They might have decent stats. The issue is they're not so great when it comes to armor piercing. Unlike the Gorgers. Like, this is the reason the Gorgers are so good. It's like the Gorgers are really good against armor, which the dwarves have aplenty. You don't want to fight the dwarves with an early game ogre army. They'll tear you to shreds with their range units, and Belegar with his ancestral heroes is more than capable of beating you on his own. So you need to be careful when it comes to that. The problem is, since Belegar has good relations very good relations with the border princes, every fight you pick against the border princes is going to piss him off, and you might end up in a war with him. Now, you have several choices of dealing with this. You could either take Matorka, then go for Akondarf, then turn your army around and go over for Karak-Izor. And you might be able to arrive just at about the same time that Belegar is laying siege to it. Between the Greenskin garrison that's going to be here, as well as your own army, you might be able to beat Belegar, then beat the Greenskin, take this entire territory for yourself, wipe out Belegar, then turn your attention on the border princes. Or you can save up a bunch of money and literally bribe Belegar for a non-aggression pact, take the border prince's territory, and once you've taken this territory, you can go for Sartosa. Your army is pretty good against Sartosa. Sartosa won't be able to really stand much of a chance against you. Take out Sartosa itself, take over Tylea, trade Tylea to Belegar, and you should be able to make a deal. Or get a peace agreement with the border princes, force march your way to Sartosa, trade Tylea, then turn your attention on the border princes. Because of the diplomatic benefit you have, you can make non-aggression pacts with a lot of the factions over here. An alternative plan, though, as opposed to doing that and then doing whatever else you want, an alternative plan would be this. Take Akondarf and then ignore the border princes. Literally, just ignore the border princes for now. They might go over for, they might march against your territory, so you might want to march back against them. But what you can do, and this could be highly recommended, actually, because you're pretty strong against Imperial factions. The Empire as a whole is very weak. And you're not too shabby against the Vampire clans, though I would not pick a fight with Vlad. But what you can do, and this is what Skrag's AI tends to do, he goes over here and wipes out Averheim, or does significant damage to them. So one of the things you can do in Skrag's campaign is you can come over here, take over Averland, and then either make diplomatic deals with Gelt or wipe him out, or go for Stirland. You could go and conquer the entire empire, and the empire is not good against you. This is the critical aspect here. You don't have to deal with Belegar, you don't have to worry about dealing with the border princes for early on. And yeah, sure, eventually you will have to deal with the border princes, but it's a much better thing to do a circle around here, take Averheim, maybe take Nuln, and then march south through Fort Sol after dealing with Gelt, and then dealing with Belegar, because by that point you should be able to field 2 entire armies, especially if, let's say, you take the Moot, you take Stirland, and then you trade Stirland, or you make deals with Vlad, or you wipe out Vlad and get the gold mine over here. For instance, there are choices that you could go for Empire. So you have decisions that you can make if you're playing a Skrag. Like, you can either head north into the Empire, head west, deal with Sartosa, fight Ikekla, potentially fight Belegar. And I do emphasize that you should be making deals with the. You should be looking to get trade partners. This is going to be important for your economy. There's a lot of trade resources you can acquire early on. That you have salt and you have 2 pastures in your starting province. Then there's marble. Then there's marble exotic animals and pottery in the western border princes. And over here we have more pottery in Everland. And we also have wine, I believe, or I don't think it's necessarily wine, but there could be a strategic building either way. Or you could just take over Salon, trade it to another faction, do something with that. There are, however, resources you can use, and you can actually gain a decent amount of trade income. Or you could decide to instead go for the Badlands approach. Take Barrackvar, take Varenka Hills, make an alliance with Wurzag, and just wipe out Karazak Rak. Though bear in mind, making an alliance with the Greenskins, although it's certainly a perfectly viable plan, carries with it the downside that you will not have a trading partner, so your economy is going to be weak. You can generate a lot of money for trade, but that means making deals with Imperial factions, or the Vampire Counts, or some other factions like the Dwarves. There is a -25 version that you have to deal with. Like if we were looking over here, the Empire has a -10 aversion. The Dwarves, however, have a -25 aversion. But Dwarves can be great allies if you're capable of overcoming their aversion against you. Just be aware of that particular situation. You can avoid a war against Belegar, provided you sell him a lot of territory. If you don't have enough money to bribe him with a non-aggression pact, here's what I do. I just save money, and then as my diplomatic relations with him start going down and down, I just pay money for that non-aggression pact. Another thing you could do is take the western border princes and just trade it to Belegar and let him deal with Sartosa, let him deal with Ikekla, and don't even have to bother with this entire province, and then go and conquer the Badlands yourself. Fighting Wurzag, however, is a dicey proposition, I gotta say. The reason it's a dicey proposition is that although his individual armies are not so strong, he has a lot of them. And he's going to spam 3-4 armies within, like, let's say the first 10-15 turns. Now, Wurzag tends to lose, because what he does is he throws a lot of things against Barrackvar, then Malagor and Queek come in from the south, take his core territories, and he ends up losing the campaign. But picking that fight early on against his main armies is a really dicey affair. You could take the Stone Mine Tower instead, trade it to Wurzag, and then go take these territories from Barrackvar and from the Scabby Eyes, and then go for Iron Rock. You don't really care too much about a specific type of territory. In individual territories, like, it's easy enough to upgrade your structures, but you need to be a bit strategic where you place your camps. You want to pick a central location where you place your first camp. You're going to get your first camp within the first 2 turns. It should be in the direction that you're heading, and should be in a location that the AI can't easily attack. So, for instance, my first camp, if I'm going for the west, I would place it here, around here, or closer to the bridge, like a bit inland, so not an easy location to attack, not a location that AI can just easily get to, regardless of where they're coming from, unless it's the underway, unless Belegar's using the underway to get me, but I'll see that coming. That's just one example. Or close enough to Barak Var, which is another pretty safe location. I mean, yes, the AI can cross over here, but Barak Var is like one of the strongest natural choke points from the campaign map perspective. Like, you have this bridge, it's an absolute nightmare for anyone to attack Barak Var with their armies, at least through the south. So having a camp right here can be really important. It can make it really safe. Or over here, or you know, next to Blackfire Pass, pretty solid to have a camp there. Not having the other way though in this particular location can be pretty painful. Now, I'm not too fond of going after the Badlands. I would prefer going after the Empire, because I think the fight in the Badlands tends to become a mess. Generally speaking, Thorgrim is on the back foot early on against Skarsnik, but usually manages to win. Warzak does gain some early successes, but then Queek and Malagor, maybe Skarbrand come in and wreck his core territory. He tries and turn around. He ends up losing the fights against Queek. And then eventually it ends up getting wiped out either by Queek or by the dwarves coming for him. The biggest early game problem for you is going to be Belegar. After that, potentially Warzak, Queek, Skarsnik maybe if he does well. It's kind of weird because if, like, most of the time Thorgrim tends to be Skarsnik, but if you make an alliance with Thorgrim, like as Belegar for instance, or in Zungrim, you generally have to bail his ass. And I've seen this actually happen as Skrag, though I haven't seen Thorgrim being wiped out when playing as Skrag, but I've seen him certainly struggle against Skarsnik. Anyway, those are your paths. You do have a great deal of flexibility in this campaign, which I think is great, because a lot of campaigns tend to be fairly linear, whereas with Skrag you genuinely have options. Yes, your victory conditions do require you to wipe out one faction, but the Border Princes are a faction that may not be long for this world. Even if you ignore them, Sartosa is just going to come around and wipe them out. Then Sartosa tends to lose against Belegar, all that stuff, but if you decide to ignore the Border Princes, chances are someone's going to wipe them out. Either Sartosa or maybe the Scabii or Warzak will go for them. So you could possibly just go on and conquer the Empire and your victory conditions would be fulfilled anyway. Or you go in, conquer a portion of the Empire, then turn with 2 stacks from south after dealing with Gelt and dealing with Belegar, dealing with the Border Princes, taking all this territory, or just dealing with the Border Princes and trying to make deals with Belegar. There are various choices. One particular option that you could go for early on in your campaign is take out this army, start recruiting Ogre Bulls, go for Karakazor, and trade it with Belegar. Trade it for some kind of diplomatic agreement with Belegar, so that you are free to deal with the Border Princes. There are various decisions. Your army is better in an open field than in a siege, but you are pretty effective as well when it comes to siege battles. That's all there is to say. Costin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.